Great. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome panelists to what is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've been putting on, focusing on confronting the drug war. And one of the fantastic ways I think that we can advance discussion is by confronting the war on drugs and journalism specifically. So we're really pleased to have with us today Manisha Krishnan, Sam Fenn, Zachary Siegel, and Garth Mullins to talk about journalistic coverage of the war on drugs, what responsible journalism can mean, and what's important looking forward to stories on the drug war in the place that we're in right now. I'm Ryan McNeil, and I'll be moderating. I'm an associate professor in the Yale program in addiction medicine and director of harm reduction research. The webinar series is co-sponsored by the Yale program in addiction medicine, the UCLA Center for Social Medicine, the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, the National Survivors Union, which is formerly the Urban Survivors Union, the Drug Policy Alliance, and the Ford Foundation. I'll give each of y'all a moment to introduce yourself, and I'm just going to go clockwise by my screen, starting with Manisha.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Okay, sorry. Can you start with someone else? I think I'm getting mail delivered. I'm sorry. This is very embarrassing. I'll be back.
Let's bounce to Garth.
Hey, everybody. My name's Garth Mullins. I'm based in Musqueam and Squamish and Squamish Territory here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I make the Crackdown podcast with Sam here and a few other people. I'm a member of the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. I'm a PhD student at UBC, and I'm an old school dope fiend going back 3 decades. So there you go. Back to you, Manisha. I hope you got your mail now.
Zach?
Hey, everybody. I'm Zach Siegel. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, and I've been on the drug beat for almost 10 years somehow. And much of that time has been spent freelancing, and I've made that work by applying for grants and kind of hustling, and have just wanted to kind of stay independent and chase down the stuff I want to cover in this topic. And so as we'll probably talk about, there's just not a lot of jobs on the market for drug journalists. So we all make it work however we can. And so that's what I've been doing. And I just try to cover all aspects of this disaster we're in. I don't think epidemics last 30 years. So, we're at whatever we are, and it needs coverage.
Thank you. And Sam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Fenn. I'm a radio documentarian and the senior producer of Crackdown podcast, which I make with Garth Mullins here in Vancouver, Canada. I'm heading on almost 10 years of doing journalism about the drug war and the overdose crisis here in Vancouver. And I'm excited to hear from all the panelists today and then to answer your questions. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. And finally, Manisha.
Hi. So I'm a senior reporter at Vice News. I've been a journalist for about 15 years. I've been at Vice for almost 8 years and have been sort of covering drugs in some capacity almost that entire time. I live in Brooklyn now, but originally from Vancouver. So kind of the birthplace of a lot of drug activism, of a lot of, harm reduction, first safe injection site in North America, things like that. And yeah, I just think, as Zach said, there's not a ton of jobs out there for dedicated drug journalists, but it is, one of the biggest public health crises that we're facing in North America. And frankly, a lot of the coverage could be a lot better. So I feel it's important to do it. And I'm glad we're talking about this.
Awesome. Thank you all. To start us out, and really to bring the audience up to where we are, I'm wondering if you could talk about what role journalism has played historically in upholding the war on drugs through its narratives, and through that, what in turn journalism owes communities of folks who use drugs. Maybe starting with you, Garth. And Garth, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm sure Sam, my producer, would wish to see that mute happen more often. When I started out using drugs, I was just a journalism consumer. I've been a freelancer and a documentarian for, a bit over 10 years, but the major mainstream news, at least in Canada, covered the drug war with a great deal of consensus. Back in the 90s particularly, it's just like it's almost like if you see in South Park where Mr. Garrison says drugs are bad, okay? It's basically that, right? Like there's no science involved, but particularly drug users get scapegoated for all of society's ills, or lots of them. And this was brought back to me recently by some of the returning coverage around big political events in Canada, where drug users are again, drug users mushed together with no nuance, with people with mental health issues, people without housing, all sort of shoved together in a big Schellenberger mush to create a convenient scapegoat. And that's a very historic type of journalism here, going back a long way. We had a very famous book come out by a judge called The Black Candle, a century ago in this country. And it played a big role in popularizing all of the sort of racist moral panic around drug use. The papers in my city, in Vancouver, covered the very first drug arrests. They covered opium dens. They covered a great deal of xenophobic fear-mongering around Chinese Canadians and Chinese migrants and people from different parts of the world who were bringing this opium with them that was going to somehow imperil and weaken and enfeeblize the proud white race. And Canada was started off as this big Aryan dream. So a lot of the newspaper coverage really followed that very closely. And of course, a lot of the politics back in the day was like that, but it stayed remarkably consistent over a century, over a long period of time, that it was very, the mainstream journalism acted as a propaganda organ for the drug war. And so I think journalism owes us a reckoning with that history. And in some places we start to see that, but in some places it just kind of continues very unabated.
Well, thanks, Garth. And, I'm wondering, this is really a rare group that's been covering drugs in a relatively dedicated fashion for quite a while. And I'm wondering, if we think about how coverage has changed over time, what have you seen in terms of what coverage of the war on drugs looks like in, Manisha, for example, the 15 years of covering this, or have you seen substantive changes in the tone and content of coverage?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the problem. Like, I think Garth gave a great overview of the sort of more historical perspective, but even if we look at modern history, let's say, when I started working at Vice, I was covering cannabis, and I very closely covered Canada's shift from the black market to legalizing it. And there was just so much hysteria. It was like, weed is worse than fentanyl. That came from a politician. Nurses were saying things like that. Weed is just as bad as cigarettes. Countless op-eds about think of the children. And it spouted some ridiculous policies. You're allowed to, in certain places, you can grow weed, but nobody can see it from the street level because, God forbid, children see a plant. It's sort of that's kind of a more funny example, but of course we have these much more egregious examples, such as when people of color are stopped and searched and sometimes killed by police. You will sort of later have their drug tests come out, sometimes very early on, and people will they'll get blamed for their own deaths. Like George Floyd is probably one of the most famous recent examples of this. And the media is totally a participant in that. And I think they are sort of guilty of not questioning the police enough and not sort of treating the police like a political organization that has an agenda, just like every other political organization does. And so, like, why are they releasing this drug report so early on? Because they withhold information all the time. And I think we're seeing a new iteration of the same phenomenon with fentanyl, with sort of the hysteria over cops touching fentanyl and then they can overdose from that, which is scientifically inaccurate. But also sort of the politicking and the like, fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction, cartels. And there's like a dog whistle. Sometimes it's a dog whistle. Sometimes it's just blatant xenophobia that's going on. It's the newest boogeyman, but unfortunately we're seeing the media sort of parrot a lot of these ideas without questioning them. So.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think a lot of us can think to recent coverage around xylazine, where it's the new zombie drug. But a few years ago, it was, well, in certain parts of Canada, before that, it was benzodope as the new zombie drug. And before that, it was bath salts as the new zombie drug. And then before that, it was methamphetamine as the new zombie drug. And these narratives seem rigid, constant, and woven through so much of the coverage that we see over time, almost lazily picking them up. And I think through, and certainly one of the things that comes across in all of the work that you all do is, I think, the care and thoughtfulness to disrupting drug war narratives. And I'm wondering if, maybe tell us a little bit about how you approach journalism in a way that's oriented toward disrupting these common narratives around drugs, maybe starting with Zach and then Sam.
Yeah, sure. First off, I just want to echo what everyone is saying, is just that it kind of blows my mind how much of an influential role news media culture plays in the formation of drug policy and just the conventional wisdom, the kind of water that we're all just swimming in as news consumers and consumers broadly. And I think when it comes to kind of disrupting that conventional wisdom, there's kind of this line that I struggle to walk with. And it's like, on the one hand, how effective is debunking something over and over again, and do some, like, by debunking so rigorously and critically, am I amplifying the thing being debunked unintentionally? And so what I've liked to do in a bunch of my work is just write the narratives, like the old conventional wisdom, out of the story entirely. Like, if I'm writing about MDMA, I don't need to mention the NIDA ads saying that it melts holes in your brain. Like, it's a ridiculous, flawed, objectively false notion. And so it's like, I'm just writing about MDMA as like the thing itself. And I think what so much journalism does is write about drugs as this symbolic container that we pour our fears and anxieties into. And drugs are just such a malleable, I guess they call it the floating signifier. Like, they can mean anything. And especially with fentanyl, it's like, to get to the xenophobia stuff, it's like talking about TikTok is digital fentanyl. It's like using seeing how people use the language of drugs in my work. I just try to be like as concrete and materially rooted as I possibly can be. And so it's that question of, do I really amplify something by like straight up debunking it, or do I decide to completely write it out and write around it and write something better to take its place?
Just to add on to what everybody has been saying, when Garth and I and the Crackdown editorial board and Ryan, when we were starting to come up with the idea to make this podcast called Crackdown, back in 2018. One of the major things that we observed about the way the news media was covering the overdose crisis at that point was that they covered it as a kind of a drug use as a kind of a social problem, and there was liberal and conservative ways of doing that, but it was not covered with the kind of rigor that a public health crisis was normally covered with. There was not many attempts to understand what the drivers of the crisis were, what the solutions could be, and a lot of sort of quick narrative shorthands formed and became very cemented in people's minds, and these meta narratives still really constrain the way people can think about what's going on. So just to say a few of them, I mean, one would be that the crisis was caused entirely by the Sacklers and a kind of loose handing out of pills that took place. There was a kind of a narrative that treated fentanyl as if it was a pure and consistently deadly poison that was unable to be used safely in any way, which was easier for readers to understand, but and you know, avoided the problem of having to go into detail about what actually was causing so much death, about a switch in the drug supply from one thing or another, and it was probably just a level 2 of too much detail for most of the reporting to talk about, you know, the way like unpredictability of dosage was such a huge part of what was driving death. And then there's, you know, some, obviously there's also this kind of way that people who use drugs are were always painted in sort of desperate, miserable circumstances, and their lives appeared to be, you know, sort of awful. And unless they could sort of cease drug use, that there was like really no kind of there was no really other point for them. There was very little understanding of the quality of life many people could have on heroin in particular. And so when we started the show, you know, we were like, well, we have all these misconceptions we're going to have to constantly be challenging. We're working with a population of people, like the people who are on our show and who help make the show, like their lives are caught in this drug war, and we need, and we want to be able to like, we want to be able to kind of represent them in a fulsome way that isn't just like only about dope sickness and overdose. We wanted to show that people have their own, people have stakes in their lives that aren't about drugs, even if they use drugs, and let people relate to people who use drugs, and understand the experience of what it was like. And from our point of view, documentary was particularly well suited for this. You could tell stories that had all kinds of esoteric, technical detail in them, frankly, really dull detail, but that was important for understanding what was going on. And you could also, there's an intimacy with radio in particular, where you get to know people as humans and you care about them. So for us, what we wanted to do was sort of attach everything to narrative and character. Have people care about these issues because they care about the person that they're hearing, and have people understand the technical and dull, complicated, or heterodox information that we were delivering to them, because it was like attached to narrative form, so it was more digestible, and also because we make this show. Garth is a member of Vandu and a drug user, and our editorial board is drug users. We also wanted it to be really, really good, because we didn't want people to look at it and go, you know, it's cute that they're trying to do their own stories. We wanted people to take it seriously. So, and radio documentary, you know, was a way we could do that. Yeah.
Manisha, I'm curious as to how that's been balanced in your work, which has involved both longer form documentary pieces and kind of direct news reporting, and how you've balanced the more narrative driven pieces alongside the need for real-time reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to, I'm just kind of going to hit on some of the points that that we've talked about, but going back to even the xylazine, like the Trank story. So Vice did a documentary. I did a documentary on that like a year ago, basically. And at that time, I tried to get the DEA, the CBP, Department of Homeland Security, like I tried the FDA. I was trying to get answers out of all of these organizations, and they basically had nothing to say, or they just pushed me off onto someone else. There was barely any reporting about this at the time. The only reason that we sort of were able to get the access that we were was by talking to drug users and also people who sell drugs. So, when we talk about people who use and sell drugs as being experts, like that's a perfect example of what I mean, because so many people reached out after, and, people who use drugs and were basically thanking us or were commenting on our YouTube saying like they were sort of creating a forum of their own, but it was like a warning for people about what is in the drug supply. Now you see all of these politicians and all of these organizations kind of like latching onto it. I'm getting press releases daily about so-and-so senators like cracking down on xylazine. Now they have something to say because it's kind of an easy sort of political thing to like act tough about. But I think that I think it's also frustrating when you see this cycle repeating itself like in real time. Like a year ago, this is a relatively unknown drug. Now it's blowing up. We tried to illustrate in our doc how prohibition has led us to this point where we are increasingly getting, a worse and worse drug supply. And yet you have kind of politicians like latching on to the same solutions that we have been trying for decades now. And then in terms of narrative, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think in that particular doc, a lot of it was centered around this fentanyl dealer, Keisha. And she was such a fascinating character to me because she was sort of determined to not sell benzo dope. She was like, I'm going to sell clean fentanyl, which is kind of like a mind-boggling concept to a lot of people. But she wanted to keep her community of drug users safe in that way. And so it's like a very interesting moral line that she's riding. And I think, there's a lot of people or perhaps news outlets that would have treated her in a more judgmental way. But we went into that really thinking like she is an expert. She's actually putting herself out there to people, like very much risking arrest because she wasn't wearing a mask or anything because she wants to warn people about what's going on in the drug supply. And there was a lot of nuance to her life. Like she's seen a lot of pain and she's dealt with a lot of things. There's just no, there's this big dichotomy, I think, in media of like drug user, drug dealer. One is bad, one is a victim. And I think that dichotomy doesn't actually exist in real life. And so I think there's narrative things that you can do to sort of show that nuance. Sorry, Ryan, I don't know if that actually answered your question, but.
That's perfect. And I think you also raise a number of important questions about the ethics of doing journalism with people who use drugs and for people who use drugs. And I think maybe building on that, people, I think that's a fantastic example of people being engaged in things that are criminalized. We know that so much coverage of drugs is incredibly stigmatizing, both in terms of the narrative frames, but also the images that are often used to show people who use drugs. And I'm wondering if y'all could chat, maybe starting with Garth, about what a journalism for people who use drugs might look like, that engages with these questions in a way that is intended to disrupt, uphold, and ultimately, hopefully, empower, as people can be given space to voice solutions to the challenges in their communities.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Crackdown. We set out self-consciously to make movement journalism. We wanted to make something that was a tool of communication to the broader world from the social movement of people who use drugs, but also a communication to us, to ourselves. And the goal, to me, the biggest goal of something like Crackdown is to increase community power, to leverage, the listenership and the sort of platform that you get into community activists, organizations having more strength, more power, more influence over decisions that affect our lives. And we set out to do that structurally by having an editorial board that wasn't like a focus group of random individuals, but is made up of people who are leaders in different parts of the movement and who bring the years of experience, not only of having been criminalized in the drug war, but also having led those different parts of the movement. So we have people from the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society on our editorial board. We used to have two. One has died, Cherise Kiwatan, but Shelda Castor helps us produce content that has to do with how colonization and the drug war impact each other. We've covered how anti-Black racism and the drug war conspire to make a much, much harder hit on some communities. We've covered these different parts of the drug war because they affect different parts of the movement and different parts of our editorial board. And it's also a movement goal to have greater solidarity. So part of one episode we created was around defunding the Vancouver Police Department and sort of like looking to a future where police weren't so well funded, because our police's budget has really almost doubled in the last decade. And it's mostly because of like police forces all over North America have had great budgetary expansions because of the drug war. And we wanted to collaborate with other groups, in the drug user movement, the local Black Lives Matter chapter, all that. And it was the movement's desire, I believe, that we assist in that. And I think that we did with that episode. So we're looking to help build the movement and help increase its strength. And we're relying on a forum that was created in the way that originally very brave journalists were covering lynchings in the US. And the emergence of movement journalism came from the struggle of Black people in the US facing like extreme racist violence and not seeing it covered. And so that the form and the description, and even the name movement journalism, I believe, comes out of that experience. And we're relying on it, as so many social movements have before. Our movements recognize that we're not really inventing new tactics for drug users. We're just relying on tactics that lots of movements have used before, civil disobedience, mass direct action, that sort of stuff. So, we cover when civil disobedience is happening. Like, for example, the Drug User Liberation Front is a group that has given out this. I don't know if you can see this. This is tested heroin. Sourced the group, which contains many drug user activists, including myself, sourced heroin, meth, and coke, ran it through a mass spectrometer to make sure there weren't surprise elements in it that could cause overdoses, and then gave out small amounts of it to members of our own groups and community to show to the government how simple a safe supply program could be. And of course, this is highly illegal, and we were able to protect ourselves by doing good journalism coverage of it, as many other journalists now have, and by bringing lots of people together. So I think journalism plays a role, just in the way Zach was saying, in changing the narratives that inform policy and inform common sense, and I think Zach said, in the water that we're all swimming in. And so we're just trying to show, primarily show the existence of this movement, that there's human beings behind these policies, or that are affected by these policies, and there's a movement of people who've organized themselves to oppose them. And that's something I wish that all other journalism would do. Often drug users are seen as victims or villains, like hapless waifs with no agency, or evil people who are bringing down society. But you don't get a chance to see people reflecting on the policies that are affecting them, or organizing, or taking back their own situation. But everywhere where I've been, even where there's no drug user organization, drug users have informally organized themselves in some way or another. And that's often thought of by outsiders as a super shabby and shady thing, when actually it's very self-protective and harm reducing.
Great, thank you, Garth. And I think the example of Crackdown is fantastic. It's something that is very movement driven, drug user led, and yet Zach and Manisha, I know like you're in different media environments in the work that you're doing. Zach, I'd be curious as to how you navigate a lot of this, for example, as a freelancer, where you might not have the same level of editorial control, even when it might come down to the images chosen for things that you might publish.
Yeah, I envy Crackdown as a project and think it's like, I wish we could replicate Crackdowns, all over. I think it's such an amazing model and is just entertaining and fun, which like I think a lot of journalism about this topic in particular just isn't.
Thanks.
And as far as navigating all of the thorny ethics of this coverage, like I've just really come to adopt like a informed consent type of model. And it's funny, my partner, she's a clinical psychologist, and the deeper I get into journalism, like the more I see like my job as a interviewer as being like as taking it that seriously. And like I'm not HIPAA protected, but like I tell people like, hey, you maybe shouldn't tell a journalist this about whatever the situation is, or like even informed consent, not about like I mean, yeah, like risks and benefits for sure, but also like what this story won't do for you. Like this might not change your life in any measurable better way. Actually, like it could make things worse. And so just being honest and upfront with sources about what talking to the media means. And I think a lot of people without publicity training and media training and because like those are straight up industries that take people through this kind of very I don't know, like intensive cycle of here's how to talk to media. And everyday people just don't think a lot of this stuff through, don't have the information. And so like in some ways I tell sources to just not talk to me, or to only talk to me under these very strict conditions with pseudonyms. And because like let's face it, we're talking about people incriminating themselves in front of massive audiences. And at the end of the day, that's I think maybe the central ethical problem with drug journalism is and I think maybe another one is by covering fentanyl and xylazine and all these things, like are we again accidentally, unintentionally contributing to hysteria? Like we have to just be very careful of the language we use and how we frame things, the style, the language, everything is really, I think, like in our work here among us, we're just careful. We just care a lot. And it takes a lot of care to not fuck it up. Like that's at the end of the day, like I think one of the big lessons is like just really truly caring, and that means being pretty obsessive, like reading a paragraph 100 times to make sure like there's no way this can be misconstrued or misinterpreted. And I think that level of care just isn't maybe always there in a lot of the journalism that maybe doesn't cover drugs as a beat, but maybe sees it as like, this is the story of the week or something like that. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on the ethics. I guess that it is just really treating people as not strictly as sources to do a transaction with, but like as full, dynamic, complex people.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Certainly dovetailing with that, there's a fantastic question in the Q&A from Sheila Vicaria with the Drug Policy Alliance. And Manisha, if you don't mind, I'll maybe put that to you first. But I think it spotlights a larger issue of what gets coverage, what gets attention, and what doesn't. So Sheila asks, I've noticed a notable lack of coverage lately about the San Jose police union director specifically, being charged with importing fentanyl. Can you talk a little bit about the role of journalists in selectively covering issues, and how they frame them, and how it affirms racialized and classed ideas about who sells drugs?
Yeah, that story was wild. You guys should check that out if you haven't seen it. But yeah, this is a tough question to answer, because I kind of think it speaks to like the wider issues with journalism and just with like a lack of resources and a lack of interest. Like I've been among groups of other journalists who are honestly quite snobby when I tell them I'm a drug reporter, especially a drug reporter for Vice. It's like they sort of treat it in a way that's a bit condescending, or it's like, oh, that's like a cute kind of hobby beat, instead of actually being like a very serious beat, where this war on drugs has impacted so much, racist policy throughout the decades, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of people that we have who are actually dying. And I don't know, like, I think maybe this is a little bit offbeat to what Sheila's asking, but I think there's a problem with just elitism in journalism. And I think that impacts like how we cover things and how we view drugs. I think like you can even notice it in the framing of these stories about fentanyl, like cocaine that's laced with fentanyl. So you have these stories that blow up. I think the Wall Street Journal did one not too long ago where it was like 3 wealthy people in New York died from doing blow that was laced with fentanyl, and they got it from the same dealer. Or like you have like a young white person who tragically dies, taking a counterfeit pill. These are the stories that get the most attention because there's that very easy sort of boogeyman victim dichotomy that I referenced earlier that's going on, instead of sort of recognizing the fact that the most people who die of fentanyl overdoses were taking fentanyl. They knew that they were taking fentanyl. There's a problem with the volatility in the supply, so we don't actually know, like, nobody can dose properly. But those people who are addicted to heroin, for example, like they're not as sympathetic. And I think a lot of journalists themselves cannot relate to that. And so they just don't find that as interesting, unless it's like a big, sexy story that they're hoping to submit for a Pulitzer. Sorry, that sounded very cynical. But so I think there's just a larger systemic issue, and we've seen it not only with drugs, but with the way that we've covered racism, the way that we've covered gender, who is actually employed in these newsrooms, who is making the story, making decisions. Did they all go to Ivy Leagues? No offense. I mean, I guess I'm talking to a Yale crowd, but like, it's like there's, if you can't relate to people, you're not necessarily going to spend as many resources kind of doing a good job covering the issues that they're facing. And I think that's exactly why when you have outlets like Crackdown, and like, I'm sort of making the case, I think, for having people with lived experiences do this type of reporting.
Great, thank you. And I think hitting the lack of specialist coverage in some of the bigger outlets is really fair. I mean, you all cover drugs well. When I hear from any one of you, I'm going to get back to you. Whereas we get constantly contacted as academics by journalists from outlets like the Wall Street Journal and The Economist and others, and you just shrug because some hateful piece is usually coming down the pipeline. Sam and Garth, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, this question of story selection and what gets covered and what doesn't. I know it's something that we go around a lot in regards to Crackdown, especially as a community-driven project. And I'm wondering if one of you could talk about how that process unfolds in terms of what the podcast coverage covers.
Sam, I don't know, I'll take a shot at it. There's the ideal way, and then there's the real way. The ideal way is the community needs to talk about something, or something's happening, and the editorial board meets, and we get on a topic and we find a character that helps take the listener through, and then we pull together research and find studies, find researchers that sort of help elevate and sort of shine that like halo of academic knowledge on top of what the expert drug user person in the life is already saying. Of course, there's also money, right? So you have to have money to pay people to do something, because we don't run this thing on volunteer. We pay everybody, an hourly living wage. Living wage in most cities. I don't know if it's a living wage in Vancouver anymore, but to do this work. And so we have to find the money to do it. And some topics don't have research on them yet. And so we often seek money through academic sources so that we can cover research and do knowledge mobilization. So it's a little more difficult when things are breaking and quickly in the real world. And so Zach said he wishes that he could have crackdowns everywhere. Well, that's one problem we keep taking with us. So for example, we wanted to make a story about benzodope for a year before we were able to do it. So that the editorial board process sometimes makes story selection slower, but money sometimes means that you have to search hard for the money to cover the thing you want to do. I mean, I want to find some, wealthy philanthropist somewhere that'll just say, here's $1 million, go make 2 or 3 years of stories about whatever you want. And then what we would do is we would cover the backlash. Because right now, I'm sorry if I've seemed a little distracted this morning. I keep getting reports in. The police are raiding the blocks where Vandu is. I'm about, about a kilometer east of there right now, or I don't know, 2/3 of a mile, whatever the fuck. So like the police have cordoned off the 4 blocks around Vandu where there's a tent encampment down the city, because it costs $2,500 a month for an average apartment here in this city. And now the police are raiding the people who are living in tents after they have evicted them from 3 other parks over the previous 2.5 years. And this is involving local city government as well as larger provincial, almost like the state government. And it's got sign off from all kinds of people on the left and the right. Well, not the left, the political center. And they're taking 100 cops and they've blocked off these blocks, and they're slowly moving down the blocks and decamping people. That's this word we're hearing, decamping to nowhere. And the media has covered this in such a way as to create a law and order fearmonger using things like stranger attacks and zombie drugs and chronic offenders. And these ideas have been circulating in the media since 100 years ago. Since the beginning of the drug war here, there was one chronic offender who was wired to heroin who keeps stealing people's luggage, and they reported on her, in the early 1900s in this city. And we're seeing the same patterns again, and the media are falling for it again. We had a new city government sweep to power based on this fear mongering. It's exactly what Manisha was saying, is that the cops have had a very, very nuanced communication strategy where they have really scared the shit out of voters in Vancouver. And so if we could choose our stories, we would be reporting on this stuff in real time. We would have enough staff, we would have enough people to cut tape and walk around with microphones that we would be able to track this shit in real time, and we can't. We're hoping to send somebody down there today. I'm going to be down there for meetings today myself, where this is all happening, but it's very difficult, right? So this is where our great crackdown process falls on its face, is that the movement is experiencing real-time crises and traumas from the state, where traditional media is actually assisting them, telling a very pro-police narrative, even here in, the vaunted and celebrated Center of Harm Reduction, Vancouver. And we're not able to keep up. So I apologize for being a little distracted, but this is happening, and we're getting texts from people who are there right now.
I mean, that's fucked. It's fucked that that's happening right now, though not surprising, given that we've known it's been coming. And I think you really draw out something important right now, and that's really we seem to be confronted by 2 things. One is the continuation of these narratives, but they're also being weaponized in new ways by a resurgent right-wing media that is networked, that is connected, and that can roll out these stories very rapidly in real time. I'm thinking about the chaos that ensued after it was Beacon coverage of SAM's potentially funding crack pipes last year through harm reduction grants. We can think about the street sweeps that are happening in cities across North America right now as we displace people who don't have houses to who the fuck knows where, to put it really bluntly. And I'm wondering, maybe starting with Manisha and then to Sam, and then cycling back to you and you, Garth and Sam, how can we characterize the media environment that we're in right now and what it means for coverage of drugs, specifically in this moment of right-wing weaponization and populism around drugs and the war on drugs?
That's a tough question. I also wanted to tag on just quickly, like I've noticed this real sort of citizen journalism movement happening all along the West Coast. You see it like basically every day. There's people who go out in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, or in Portland or in Vancouver, and they basically, it's just like poverty porn. They just film people who are in the middle of an overdose, and it's become like its own viral content farm that they go out every single day and kind of without consent a lot of the time show people at their worst. And I think Zach actually was kind of making this point on Twitter the other day, but I agree. It's like a lot of it in San Francisco in particular is getting blamed on like progressive policies, but like what are those progressive policies? Like what has San Francisco actually done en masse that is like really good harm reduction? I mean, do they even have proper safe injection sites? I don't think they do. I think New York is like the only place that actually has them right now. But it's sort of like, yeah, you're seeing places that are being perceived as progressive. In reality, they have extreme wealth inequality, which is obviously fueling part of this crisis. And it's like before we've even tried a lot of these solutions like at scale, there's this major backlash that's already unfolding, and it's being blamed on kind of the lefties. And so I think that's one of the interesting sort of phenomenons right now is like this idea that all these American cities are, you know, a dystopia. And then you have people just filming poverty, and then you have it being blamed on leftist policies that actually haven't been enacted in any sort of meaningful way.
100%.
You know, to jump in on this, I would say, you know, on this question of backlash, if a mainstream media outlet does not have reporters who have specialization and sourcing relevant to the overdose crisis, all they're able to do is cover the political theater of what's going on. And the political theater is a showdown between harm reduction, you know, broadly construed supervised consumption sites in the lock zone, OAT, versus recovery or treatment, never any nuance in there's a whole wide spectrum of what recovery or treatment could mean. No one ever talks about what it is, but this is the showdown, right? Left versus right. Which solution is going to fix things? You don't have the knowledge, sourcing, or specialization to be able to look at other types of drivers of the crisis. So we're talking about decampments right now, mass eviction. There's no news reporting about the relationship between eviction and overdose. Ryan, I know you've done work on this, right? Similarly, labor policies. If you're trying to get access, the so-called safe supply that's available here in BC, your doctor is able to inform your boss and frequently get you fired, even when there's no documented workplace impairment. Similarly, if you have children, your parent, the way that your children can be apprehended when there's no evidence of neglect or abuse simply because you use drugs. Well, all of these things drive the overdose crisis because they make people they sort of wall off the possibility for people to try to access a safer supply of drugs. Those are just a couple examples, but there are so many. So in order to actually care and know what is causing death, you have to understand the topic outside of the political theater of the topic. And I think that's the main thing I see now, is this kind of, this kind of like surface coverage of an ideological debate between, say, for instance, 12-step based abstinence recovery programs and the delivery of basic harm reduction services. We need both of those things. We need recovery programs and we need harm reduction. And then we need a hell of a lot more things, because the drivers of the crisis are frankly not even just the toxic drug supply. It's the neoliberal hellscape we've created for people, the unlivable lives we've created for people, and that drive sort of potentially risky drug use. So I think that there's no we have to start telling that story. I think.
No, thanks, Sam. And I think you really capture something important here. And it's, yes, this is drugs, but those aren't things I think we cover well generally. And I'm wondering, maybe to Zach first, how are some of the problems with coverage of drugs specifically just symptomatic of much larger structural problems with journalism as a broader industry and endeavor right now?
Yeah, that's tough, and it's a big question, because I think like part of the way that I want to cover drugs is like as a consumer market, like just like we cover any other consumer market, and that to try to convey the idea that like what we call the illicit economy, that like just below the surface of this economy is the illicit economy, and that the two lines have like the lines between these two economies are quite blurry, and one can't really function without the other, and that the real world economy that we all live in and our consumers in, like grafted onto that is something like we call the illicit market or something. And I think trying to cover drugs as a commodity, like any other commodity, like I think kind of helps draw out some of the broader politics we're talking about here, vis-a-vis labor and health and employment, like everything. It is all, to use the buzzword, intersectional. And to the extent that we only focus on the behavior of drug use, we're missing the much broader environment that we're all socialized in, and think that just by nature of drug addiction actually being a pretty highly idiosyncratic and individualized phenomenon, it's tough to balance the macro with the micro. And I think we get very lost in drilling down into micro narrative stories, and then it's hard to go back up into the bigger world that we're all living in. And I struggle with that narratively, and just think that like it's very difficult, whether it's on TV or anything, to have like I don't know, like has anyone in this group ever seen like a movie about drugs that they liked? It's just like there's very few, and it's hard to narrativize, and I find it just like a difficult topic. And I'm getting like lost here in my train of thought, but just that the extent to which we're just focusing on this like individualized behavioral health problem of drug use as such, I think we kind of create this line that there is something different and essentially aberrational about addiction, as that it's like something cut off and separate from the rest of the world and society. And I think that, you know, what we're talking about is very universal, very basic human behaviors that that we all can understand and share on some level.
Thank you. And I see we're almost at time. There's two questions in the chat that I think dovetail really well around accountability. So maybe to Manisha first, then Sam or Garth. Effectively, false reporting around things like, say, fentanyl exposure by police, the retractions on those stories generally don't get close to the attention of the original reporting. And there's this question of what accountability could mean for news outlets around drug reporting. And certainly one audience member extends this to further, what can accountability mean in the context of this citizen reporting that we're now seeing of, to put bluntly, assholes going out into the field with a camera, trying to film people going through often the worst of what they could go through, made public by homelessness. So this question of what can accountability be for journalism and for news outlets, but also how can journalists like yourselves push for accountability in your reporting?
I'm 6'4" and 195 pounds. I'll bring some fucking accountability right to the front of that lens. That goof with the camera. I don't mind doing that. In fact, I have politely done that before.
Politely, yeah.
That's a tough, it's hard because it's not like we are a monolith, like all these news, it's not like you can just go to like city council or the mayor of journalism and be like, Times is not, so it's tough. I think I don't know, it sounds kind of trite. I feel like maybe just like showing by example, like trying to do the reporting that you want to see out there. Sometimes I get pissed and I'll just call outlets or certain stories out on Twitter and sort of shame. I don't know how effective that is. Sometimes it just feels cathartic for me to do that. But I will say, it gives me hope, just like the journalists in this group are doing a great job and I am starting to see, better reporting out there. But I would say, I just wish, if there are journalists on this call, if there are editors on this call, I do stress kind of the importance of having people cover this subject with rigor and with, you don't have to have like a science background. I don't, but just like a base level understanding of how drugs work would be an improvement. I think that would actually filter out a lot of these kind of false reports, just knowing that you actually can't overdose from fentanyl just by being near it or touching it. But, I don't know. It's a tough question to answer because I've done a million debunks. I've literally DM'd Zach and been like, are you debunking this? Okay, cool. I'm not going to then. It's like I could write some of these stories from memory at this point. But I guess in terms of accountability, I think if the general public starts to have a better understanding of what good drug reporting is and how drugs work and how prohibition and policies have kind of led us to this place in time, then you'll start to be able to maybe push back and I don't know, write editors when you see things that are really egregious. Because right now, unfortunately, it's experts like yourself, Ryan, and people who are loud on Twitter who are kind of doing the brunt of that accountability work. But unfortunately, I don't know what the bigger solution is.
I vote for you as mayor of journalism.
Well, with that, I think we've solved it. And Garth, Manisha, Sam, and Zach, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us. And everyone who joined us as an audience member, thank you so much. And thanks for the thoughtful questions in the chat. This concludes our webinar for this monthly session. Our next webinar will be coming up on May 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we'll have a wonderful group of folks coming together to talk about the limitations and problems of the addiction as a brain disease model. So I hope you'll all think about joining us. And thank you all so much for joining today.
Thanks, Ryan. Stay safe. Keep 6, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.